Start with welcome everybody to our CMMC Compliance and Manufacturing. Where do I start? Our expert panel discussion. We do have a good group of experts here today from multiple industries, as you can see up forward. First and foremost, I'm going to let everybody introduce themselves, get about 90 to 120 seconds to talk about who you are, where you're from, and why you're talking about compliance and manufacturing today. Rick, you have the floor.
Oh, right. Okay, great. That's why I guess you put me first, huh? So my name is Rick Earles. I'm the Senior Director of Industry and Innovation for Team NEO. I spend most of my time now working with our cluster, the Smart Manufacturing Cluster. And more recently, we've also noticed that, well, amongst many of the other challenges for improving business, one of the big issues now is especially certification, and many of the, and taking it one step further, many of our members, at least on the manufacturing side, are now have, or at least have defense-oriented content in their sales, and now are very sensitive about CMMC, and we're trying to help them embrace that, because many of those, at least in Northeast Ohio, where we spend all of our time, many of those are small to medium-sized companies, and frankly, don't have the resources and, for that matter, even all the knowledge necessary to do a great job of putting CMMC in place. Some of them are running the risk of actually losing some of the business they already have, and then some of the new startups, for example, are playing that area, also don't have the infrastructure in place to make, or at least to be able to go after future contracts. So I'm just, I want to see what all the other experts say. And I come from the standpoint, I've got a viewpoint from the manufacturers. I've worked with a number of different manufacturers in this area, and know about some of the pitfalls that haven't really been talked about yet. And so hopefully we'll be able to bring this up in the discussions.
Thanks, Rick. Drew, go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to Ken and Casey and the rest of the panelists for joining us today, and all the audience members. So this is definitely a collaborative discussion. We certainly want people to ask real life questions. My background is, I'm an attorney. I started out at Price Waterhouse doing global risk management. So I was going into entities and gathering risks and ranking them and figuring out where their biggest compliance risks were from an ops or finance or legal or regulatory world. I have a specialization in healthcare and life sciences. I work a lot with hospitals, where I was at UH, or Invacare, which is medical device. Sky Systems is a client of mine that I do outside general counsel services for, that's in the payment processing industry. So technology really is, or fintech. So really highly regulated industries that, you know, where folks are trying to understand, how do I implement a real life compliance plan where I can really know that I'm looking out for the greatest risks. And if I have a risk that actually occurs, I've got a plan to deal with it. So, and manufacturing is critical to everything. So we certainly understand the gravity of the situation and want to be helpful to give you practical nuts and bolts advice here.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Drew. Dr. Mike, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Mike Klipstein, and network engineer by training and trade. I've worked primarily cyberspace operations for the last 10 plus years with U.S. Cyber Command, offensive side of NSA. I've done research into quantifying risk for some of these intangible things. Some of that work's been pulled into a DARPA project. Some of it's been published a couple of times. Most recently, I just left the National Security Council, where I was the director of international cybersecurity policy there, advising international standards, norms, trade, and military actions. Thank you for the opportunity today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And the host of the event, go ahead, Mr. Fanger.
Hi there, I'm Ken Fanger with On Technology Partners, and I've worked for BP, I've worked in the pharmaceutical industry, and I've been doing on technology partners for almost 30 years. And we do a lot, especially with business continuity. That's one of the places that is very important. And I think people don't think and understand what that means. But it has always been a vital conversation. Like we were talking about, if you don't know what it takes to keep your company running, if something bad happens, when you find out, it'll probably cost you your company. And that's all of this. All these compliance conversations are to standardize and normalize protecting yourself. And I know it can be very frustrating and annoying, but taking that time to do it right does make a difference when things go wrong. And the one thing we all know is things will go wrong before we're done. So I'm really excited with this panel. I think all of us have seen that disaster, either from watching it from the outside or being a part when the fires start. And knowing how to know what to do next is so important, and it makes you feel so much better when it happens. So I'm excited for the questions and what we go to next.
Yep. Thank you, Ken. And absolutely, anybody, if you're in the audience, if you have any questions that you'd like to share, feel free to either raise your hand using the discussion panel, or you feel free to go ahead and put your questions in the chat, and we will take those one in order, and we'll ask them to the panel. But first and foremost, since we are here for compliance and manufacturing, I'm going to defer to Ken for this, just to give me a high level. What exactly is CMMC? What does it mean for the industry?
So that's cyber maturity model compliance. And what it's trying to do is, it used to be the DoD would let you self-certify under NIST 800-171, but they ran into problems. They ran into issues where people weren't doing what they needed to do, and the punishment came after there was a breach. The problem with dealing with a problem after the breach, and a lawyer will tell you this, is if you go to the lawyer after you've gotten sued, it might be too late to take the proper actions. So the CMMC is more of a proactive approach. If you want to get the contracts within 5 years, by 2026, if you are not at one of the compliance levels, you will not be allowed to have a contract with the Department of Defense. So by acting in a more proactive way, and they're going to require a third-party auditing. It's no longer going to be, we said we are doing good. It's going to be, they prove we are doing good. So that's what's kind of coming down. And I'm actually going to defer over to Mike to kind of explain a little more how this is a change from what was done before to what they're doing now.
So thank you. Let me illuminate the problem. In the last 6 years, the Army alone has done vulnerability assessments on 44 major weapon systems. To date, 0 of them have been mitigated. Yeah, exactly. So, but there has been $0 allocated by the Department of the Army also, or requested by the Department of the Army. So to a certain extent, I don't feel bad for them because they're not taking proactive measures to fix this stuff, even though they know, has known for some time that this is a problem. Now, there's another part of this problem that is for this conversation is, when do these people certify? In case in point, I'd like to bring out is, it takes a long time to build a naval ship, especially a large one. You know, we talk about aircraft carriers and such like that. If you look through the news, it's quite easy to Google. The last British aircraft carrier that was commissioned, Queen Elizabeth, excuse me, QE, was vulnerable the day it hit the water because it was still running Windows XP stuff on there. And so when you look at the U.S. Navy, because it takes us such a long time from the day we decide to build a ship to requirements to systems to actually lay in the keel, build it out, give it sea trials, and everything else. When you look at a laptop or desktop that you had from 10 years ago, that's probably actually more secure than some of the systems are on these ships. Technology advances so fast and it takes so long for these ships to build. These ships have proprietary software on them that nobody has certified. These ships have lack address message, or specific addressing of memory that your phone and your laptop from 10 years ago have. And so these things are not keeping up. I saw a video of somebody doing penetration testing of an Arleigh Burke destroyer in 2014, and I happened to notice that on one of the screens that was on the console was Windows NT. I mean, I can't make this stuff up. So to a certain extent, we need to figure out what that process is for CMMC. And it makes sense so that when the thing is delivered, not just when it's built or when the requirements are put in place, that the cyber maturity is there.
Absolutely, and I believe that's a good kind of just state of the union address on the cybersecurity, and then obviously where you can see it's a top-down flow approach. So I'm going to kind of take this to Rick next to just understand in terms of Northeast Ohio, since that's where we're based, but even across the country and the for-profit enterprises, how is CMMC impacting the manufacturers in your experience within Northeast Ohio? We've seen how it affects the largest institutions and organizations, as Mike just explained. How are we seeing this at the local level?
So at the local level, unfortunately, not everybody's stepped up to the challenge yet of, at a minimum, doing their own self-assessments and then putting a plan in place. It has to be submitted, of course, to the accreditation board. However, and again, if they don't step up to the plate relatively soon, they're going to, it takes a long time to frankly get your CMMC squared away, especially if you've found by doing an assessment that you've got issues that have to be addressed. So there's a lot of effort still has to go forward, but at the end of the day, in fact, we're finding a number of manufacturers right now that have to actually address CMMC now because their primes are forcing them to become compliant. Again, with CMMC, most of it is at level 3. They have to have it in place because a lot of the projects are working on. The prime wants to make sure that that organization that they're using as a sub-supplier is going to be viable when the project is finally completed and they have to do acquisition. So they're making all these small companies today become CMMC compliant. Then a lot of most of the companies I've talked to at the manufacturing level, especially the small, medium-sized companies, they don't have the wherewithal to understand exactly what all the terminology and everything else is associated with CMMC. So they've had to go find themselves, typically many of them just find themselves an IT house that they have a relationship with, and that IT house has been trying to get its, its RPO, not quite there yet. I mean, they have an assessment. They're able to identify some holes, but then they find out when they put a plan together and they send it off back to the prime says that's not good enough. And they have to go find themselves, for example, a CISO. And then they start helping them. Bottom line is, then they find that they have to purchase a whole bunch of hardware to become compliant. They have to get rid of their old Windows 98, for example, get rid of that and replace it for whatever is going to be, again, amenable to the CMMC. But then they're also finding that they're purchasing, in fact, to have those two services, first of all, the wannabe C3PAO and the CISO in tow, they're spending an additional maybe $2,000 a month, for the rest of the period of implementation, and then thereafter, because it has to be monitored on a regular basis to maintain its compliance. They're taking and finding all these extra costs, and again, relying on those service providers to help them understand the requirements, because they're not easy to understand, and put all this together. So there's a bunch of I could say issues that most people don't understand. They have to get through to maintain or to achieve the CMMC and then maintain it. So that's going to be the challenge here, and especially in Northeast Ohio, just because, again, we're typically tier 3, tier 4 type suppliers. In fact, one of the companies I've been talking to, who's directly working with a prime, is working on smart munitions, and so they have no choice. If they're going to maintain that business, they have to do their CMMC, and they're experiencing all these issues that a lot of people don't know about.
Absolutely. And I feel like that gives the audience and it gives all of our listeners a very good understanding of just the complexities of CMMC. And really, this leads into my next question, which I'm going to defer to Ken. where does a company, especially the small to medium-sized enterprise, where do they start? Because the larger enterprises typically have an in-house IT staff, network manager, they have compliance managers. But for those smaller shops going from tier 1 through 3, and even at the tip of 4, where do those companies start with their CMMC to not feel overwhelmed?
And what I would first suggest is you really have to take, obviously you want to talk with a company like On Technology Partners. I have to sell myself, that's why we're here. But the real truth is you have to ask yourself, it's going to be expensive. One of the things with one of the clients we're working with right now is they didn't realize you got to follow the information. So if you're a tier 1, that's federal contract information. And one of the things that you have to look at is wherever it's stored, wherever it's at, you have to find it. And then you have to find out who can talk to it, how can it get transferred, and how do you control it? And one of the problems the small companies run into is a lot of times their IT company has backup copies of their data or has access to their systems, which means now you have to make sure that they're compliant with you. So it's a journey that starts with, you have to define, and this is kind of that risk conversation that Drew was talking about. You got to ask, is it worth it? It is going to be expensive to get tier 3 and maintain it. There's going, if you haven't been doing NIST 800, 171, implementing it is going to take time. It will take about a year because one of the big things with CMMC is they want maturity. It's not enough to have a policy. You have to show through logs and interviews that you've been doing this policy for a while. So when they come to audit you, if they say these are the things that are missing, you're about a year out before you can try and get re-audited. So the sooner you start this journey, the faster. And you have to decide if it's worth it, because this is going to be an expensive adventure. This is not going to be something you can just decide this next 3 months, we're going to have it done, we're going to do it, we're going to be ready. If this is not part of your previous culture,
They couldn't get you to get your car done?
Whoops.
On Monday, that's fine.
Oh, my.
I was going to ask Drew from a legal standpoint, kind of one of those, what some of these compliance questions are, but he snuck off on us. But Mike, how do you feel? What do you think are some of the first steps? You've been doing this for a long time.
Drew's here.
I'm here, but go to Dr. Mike for sure, please.
I'd actually like to hear Drew's comments, please.
Well, I think first of all, I should get doctor in front of my name too, because it's like super, super awesome. Makes you sound super credible, which you are anyway. Look, I think that the response to this, Ken, is that, you know, it's scalable. So it depends on the size of your operation. If you're a $1 million, forget that. If you're a startup manufacturer, okay, and you get most of your business from a tier 1 supplier, the first thing you got to realize is that when you just look at your contract, there's going to be 6 pages of Adobe printed flow down requirements from the contractor that's directly in privity with the government. And those flow down requirements are going to have I don't know how to say it, a butt ton. That's the right phrase, I think, a butt ton of requirements that you're likely going to throw up when you read them. But here's the thing. I'm going to give you practical advice, and so is Rick, and so is Ken, and so is Dr. Mike. That practical advice is, okay, sure, if you have 2,500 employees, then you better make sure that you are completely EEOC, and DOL compliant. But the likelihood is if you have 10 employees and a CNC shop and you're milling parts for a gigantic, supplier, you're probably not even on the radar screen of the Equal Opportunity Commission or the Department of Labor. Can I give you a complete prophylactic that you're never going to get audited? No, I'm not God. I don't have a crystal ball. But I also don't think that you should take an elephant gun to shoot a flea or a tick, right? So I think the practical nuts and bolts is if we're going through something like this together, we also don't give somebody, that your compliance program startup is going to cost you $100,000. You're a startup, okay? If you are a $2 billion manufacturer, I might come in and say, holy smokes, you just had a compliance failure. You really need, a big, bad, complete risk assessment. You need deep dive people to go into your particular industry and pick this apart, redo all your policies and procedures, because you're risking your gigantic government contracts. you're risking your deals with your suppliers. You're risking your customers taking off and skedaddling and going to a competitor. So it's got to be scalable. I don't know if Rick or Mike, ring in, and I don't mean to take Ken's thunder from wanting to go to somebody else on the panel, but I think that, I know from experience that you don't want to put in place a plan or policies and procedures that if they're ever audited or monitored by a regulatory body or even your own auditing body, you can't comply because they're just words on a page. They're not being operationalized.
So I think, to your point, if it's a fresh startup, meaning one that's starting up now, not one that's in place that hasn't grown yet, the ability of getting to see CMMC is actually easier. The reason I say that is they can incorporate those things into their standards and policies and processes from the get-go, and not just offload their data to somebody else, and not just offload their responsibilities to someone else, because transferring that risk to somebody else is not a panacea for this problem. For the companies that are established in looking to be a sub to a larger prime, maybe there's a conversation to be had that the larger prime takes a vested interest in that sub to, it's not necessarily assist, but that's the best word I can come up with right now, but to help facilitate them becoming CMMC certified, because it's in that larger prime's best interest as well. Now, I don't know how that's going to affect the bottom line of the smaller company, but maybe that's a conversation we could have. For some of the things that are being built, I can't afford for a smaller company to take the cheap, easy way out as a prime. So the best example I can illuminate for that is when the HVAC company that led to Target's breach went cheap on some of the PCI stuff, as well as who had access into what systems. I mean, for those of us who were in this world for a hot minute, when you hear how that occurred, I mean, it's blatantly obvious. But for a small company that may not know better because that's not their bailiwick, or they're just trying to keep their head above water, it probably made sense. And so maybe we need to have the larger companies assist their subs in some way. Now, does that tether the sub to the larger company? I don't know. That's a potential possibility, but that also may have recurring business with that larger prime as well. Ken?
And one thing I did want to share in quick on what you're saying is the penalty. So if you do work with the government and you do not follow through on your commitment for cybersecurity, the penalty is massive. It's 3 times the cost of the contract, potential and losses. And then you definitely want to engage somebody like Drew. But you do want to remember, if you say you're compliant and you're not, and you get a contract and something goes wrong, you could have, if you have $1 million contract, you could be liable for up to $3 million plus 11,000. That can be devastating. So the stick in this is pretty massive.
There's another aspect. If there's a large breach or a large vulnerability that's exploited, you're going to come out in the news as being the one responsible. And so beyond the monetary, you're a pariah at that point.
Yes, that is true. Your PR loss is massive.
And there's ways to negotiate this in the contract on the upfront, right? So, and I get it. Everybody thinks they're a lawyer. Everybody thinks they can negotiate their own contracts. I'm not the guy that's going to say, I know everything and you don't know everything. But there are ways to negotiate this where you look at the relative risks and capabilities of the parties, right? If you are one of my clients that literally is a CNC manufacturer, probably a $4 million a year business, built it from scratch, came from Russia, literally took 2 buses to work, built his own CNC machining, and he's doing work for Alcoa. Alcoa is a gigantic tier 1 supplier. I'm sure Rick knows them. I'm sure Mike knows them. Everybody's heard of them, right? And they're basically saying, okay, I'm going to sub out to you, making gigantic nuts that go on the turrets of a cannon. Okay, it's a DoD thing. The truth is that Alcoa is a lot closer to compliance than my client was. Okay, And so when they give you all these flow down requirements, you have to negotiate up front. Now, wait a second. I can't comply with this crazy, Department of, Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation, DFAR, because I don't even do this thing. But Alcoa, you do. So there has to be some sort of indemnification or representations and warranties or covenants that Alcoa is going to back you up as the big brother if you as the small shop take a hit. Yeah, they're flow down, but there's got to be some parity. There's got to be some risk rating. There's got to be that scales of justice where you're not getting hosed. And I really do suggest, I'm not trying to sell myself, me or somebody else, take a look at that contract real close. Don't just sign it because you just want to get that money in the door, whether you're a mature company or you're a startup, because once the cat is out of the bag, you're contractually obligated to them. And unless you want to terminate the contract, now you're in and you're getting the money flowing in. It's really hard to do. And so I think it's smart to not be penny wise, pound foolish on the front end of these deals. Make sure that you're ready to take on the business, that you're really ready for it.
And one thing you can do, and this is legitimate through the CMMC, is you can have it where the prime controls the domain with the data, and you're not allowed, you have to go through their systems, they can set it up. So there are ways for very small companies to not have to get to this compliance, but they do have to work with, and this is where you do want that lawyer, because you have to have a very strong contract, and you have to define that you will not have any of this data on your system, and you will not expose yourself to that type of risk. I'm not saying it's the best way to go, but it is a way to, because it's about the data. So if you never touch the data, you don't have to be compliant. But defining touching the data can be a hard thing. And you don't want to, one of the things about this is, for any one of us, you don't want to run at this alone. And the nice thing about all the nonprofits that Rick represents and everything is, they're out there to help you. So when you ask where should you start first, I would start with the Team NEOs and the OEIs, because they can help find that next step type of conversation. Don't feel alone. And then find the lawyers that will be there for you as well. Because if you do this alone, it's kind of like trying to build your house for the first time. You're going to make terrible mistakes and it might fall in on you. And you don't want to be there when it falls.
So that's an interesting point you bring out, Ken, about what does it mean to touch the data? Because to use Drew's example of making the large nuts for a cannon, they're going to have to touch the data regardless. They may not store the data, but they're going to have to touch the data. And so at a certain, that means they're going to have to access the data. And so if a protracted enemy or adversary wishes to modify the schematics because it's going to weaken the tensile strength of the nut or change the thread a little bit of it, or in some way, shape, or form alter it so that when Drew's customer actually manufactures these things, they're going to break, or they're going to not be effective, or they're not going to just fit properly. I mean, they're still touching the data. They may not be storing it, but they're still going to have to access the data in order to do the work of the prime. How do they get?
They're absolutely, Mike, they're absolutely seeing the drawings,
right,
the engineering drawings,
right,
all day long and twice on Sundays.
exactly.
And if some rogue employee gets a hair trigger and decides to expose that stuff, oh boy.
No, I heard a story last night actually about a guy at an energy plant, nuclear engineering. They got fired, and he took a laptop and went to his car and drove up a couple of days later and connected into the networks through Zigbee and was able to shut the plant down for 3 days.
Ask Rick how much that'll cost a company if you shut the plant down for 3 days.
Yeah,
I'm guessing it's not good.
I got a rough order of magnitude estimate last night from the guy telling me the story, and it wasn't pretty.
Yeah, I would imagine not. And that's a conversation you have to have, those financial, what's it cost me if I lose this? What's it cost me to get it? And then what's it cost me if I lose it? And I think sometimes people get very excited about talking about cybersecurity, but at the end of the day, it's about your production line and your output and your revenue. And if you can't equate what you're doing to protect it to what you make, like you're talking to the $1 million manufacturing company, a $300,000 cybersecurity solution for $1 million manufacturing company may not be in proper alignment, but a $1 billion manufacturing company, that's probably not enough. And that's the type of conversations you really need to be very serious about. And when you're talking about CMMC, you got to look at what you're getting from the government versus what it's going to cost you to get there. If you're making $20,000 a year from government contracts, CMMC level 3 probably is not worth it. And so I think those are the first questions, and you can do those without contracting anyone. Though obviously if you do contract someone, they can help ask those questions better. But you need to decide if it's worth it to begin with. If it's not enough of your business, maybe it's not worth it, because you will. Even if the prime has to isolate it, they're going to have to isolate it into your CNC router, which means you might have to have a separate CNC router that is only on that project. Can you justify that cost? Those are the things you have to figure out. Or you're going to make your entire network CNC compliant, and then the cost of all of that. And those are the questions you have to ask yourself relative to what's going to come next.
This is going to sound harsh, and it's not meant to be that way, but one of the things we may have to look at as a society, especially if you have a small business, is are these larger DoD contracts or other contracts where you're the sub, where there's CMMC requirements in place, are they actually, is that use actually worth the squeeze? Is it more profitable for you to go someplace else? And to dovetail off things I've said previously and what Drew has said, maybe there needs to be a conversation where the larger prime assists in some way, shape, or form the smaller sub, because there is a symbiotic relationship between the two. And so how does, and maybe a recurring relationship could occur, but if that symbiotic relationship does not occur, then maybe there's just not a place for the smaller business to be in this field anymore.
By way of example, at Invacare, we had VA contracts, Veterans Affairs. Just one thing in there, right, was complying with the Buy American Act and the free trade agreements, right? That could take a whole person 2,080 hours, a whole person, just to comply with that one requirement. Now you're talking about millions and millions of dollars of business with the government, but you got to be prepared for that. So it's not. And so if the prime has an entire compliance department and you're the sub, you should rely on that compliance department and their expertise.
You're wholly right. I mean, the days of selling the government a $2,000 toilet seat for the B-2 bombers, those days are gone. There's ramifications now for these kinds of things, especially when it comes to cybersecurity and the vulnerabilities that are inherent within them.
Yeah, let me give you a little background. So remember I told you about that small company that's doing munitions? And so they went through their self-assessment, then they worked with their IT house. It's now trying to become, it's the wannabe C3 PAO. Then they submitted that to the prime. The prime has their own committee, CMMC committee, that does review of all their supply chain. And they were the ones that wasn't good enough. And they're the ones that introduced them to a CISO. And by putting those two entities together, they were finally able to come up with something that the prime said this would be sufficient to go forward. So you're right, Mike. The prime really played a great role here, understood they had to play that role, and they did impact it and allowed them, the small manufacturer, to get all the resources, or at least locate all the resources they needed to become compliant.
So we do have a question that I would like to address, just to make sure we get through some of these questions here. This comes from Christine Baker, and I don't know if this is directed to anybody specifically, but how are you getting the definition of covered data to know if you are dealing with CUI and know what to protect? Does it have to be clearly identified in the contract?
I will start. Unfortunately, it does not have to be. It should be identified, but it does not have to be identified in the contract. There is a full page, and I'll have to pull the website that has it, that defines what can be CUI. But the government kind of leaves that sort of up to you to make sure you're doing it. There's a wide range of things, and I will put together, I'll send out after this, the document that talks about that. But CUI does not have to be in the contract. And one of the things you have to be careful of is, even if you have a contract and you contract out DFAR requirements, they still have to be followed. So that is one of the things when I went through my training, they pounded in is DFAR supersedes the contract. And so, and one of the things is you have to protect the information. So you may have to, I would suggest contacting whoever you're working with and asking them to define any CUI they're giving, or FCI if you're a level 1. But the best rule of thumb is assume everything you're getting is CUI and work backwards from that. Because if you go the other way, you could find yourself in trouble if something gets breached. I'll let Drew. Oh, go ahead, Rick.
Yeah, and in fact, I've mentioned this even to Ken. So I'm actually working with a company, I think a number of those already exist out there, but I'm working with a company that actually making software that is in fact AI-based, that's constantly monitoring all the information, data flows going in and out of the company. And they take it upon themselves to identify CUI. Because even though when you first get your CMMC in place, you could be taking on more orders later on and having more interactions with other primes or relationships when it comes to the supply chain, defense-related supply chain. So this software will keep track of it. And in fact, based on using this software that's always monitoring what's going on with data, they can even make recommendations as to what maybe a proper segmentation of your systems would be. In other words, don't try to mix commercial production with defense-related production on any particular machine. If you segment it properly, you can probably get away with a lot less costly CMMC compliant system and still satisfy the contract, and still then go ahead and use the rest of your organization for commercial opportunities. And it won't, again, cost you as much, and you won't be as exposed, you know, I guess, what do they call it? The threat area would be drastically reduced.
Yes, you want to try and reduce your what's called coverage domain as much as possible, wherever that data, if you can. Now, small, like Drew's talking about that small CNC, that may be too small to be able to isolate the traffic out. But where you can, the smaller your footprint, the less you pay to cover it, has been the general rule. So if you cannot have your whole company, we're working with utility companies, and especially in cities. And one of the things we do is we isolate down the utility companies' control networks so that they are not interacting with the wider city. Because you can imagine the wider city has a much lower control standard than what has to be done to keep our power grids and our water systems up and running. And so this is the same thing. You want to keep that isolated as much as possible. Mike or Drew, what do you...
I would put the onus as much as you can on the prime to mark the CUI, to tell you that it is in that classification of data, so that you know what controls you need to put around it.
I agree with what Drew just said. That is their responsibility, especially if they don't want to be held liable for something that they mislabeled or misinterpreted. Put the onus upon them. They have the workforce for it.
Yeah, that's actually a great idea. They have the expertise. The primes have whole departments committed to this. Use their expertise. They want to be successful. They do not want to breach. A breach of a sub still falls onto the prime to be responsible. And so as a sub, you want to take advantage of that commitment and that power, because they might have 100, 200 people department just working on compliance, where you might have 10 people in your whole company, none working on compliance. So yeah, that's a wonderful thing to kind of phrase it from.
Oh, she said, okay, thank you. If I may, Does FOUO or District D marks count as CUI?
Mike, I'll let you start that.
I believe off the top of my head, FOUO does actually, because it's that designation in and of itself means government only or select contractors that are directly supporting the government. District D, I'm not as familiar with what that is. I've never bothered to look at the different distribution notices. I've always looked at the classification and wondered and figured out who could or could not partake in it from there.
FOUO definitely, Mike, you're right, is CUI. And the district, I think, I'm not sure. I'd have to look that one up. But I can tell you for sure FOUO is, for sure. And I'll try to find the answer for Christine. So I'm not ducking you. I'm looking. I'm Googling, trying to get her an answer.
Oh, you're ducking us, but
Mom and Matt, continue on.
She said thank you either way. So it's good that we've been able to ask. And like I said, if anybody else has questions, feel free to please put them in the chat and we will answer them. We do have about 12 minutes left on our scheduled time. One of the areas I do want to cover, since we've covered essentially a lot of the keys with any sort of CMMC compliance, is being proactive, don't going it alone, and really understanding where the data flows through from your organization, from the prime, or vice versa. Now, one of the areas that they talk about is really, what does it mean? And I'll ask the group, but Ken's first specifically because the time he's dedicated. What does it mean that CMMC is the success of that is culture driven for these organizations?
So the big thing here is, and I will tell you, when I worked for a pharmaceutical company, we had a wonderful policy book. It was 7 books long, and the entire 2 years I worked for them, nobody in the company read it. I'll tell you this story. So I was in charge of disaster recovery. Because of how they had their policies, I was literally not allowed to read the backup policy for the computers that I was taking care of, because I was only a manager. You had to be a director or higher. There's no way there's a compliance there. I can't do what I don't know what I need to do. So that's one of the big things, is it has to be shown. When you do this, it has to be shown that you're doing it. They're going to interview people. They're going to interview the person doing the job. So if they have a policy that they should have read, if they don't know that policy, you will not get certified. You will not get approved. And you'll have to show that this person has been doing it for 6 months after you start. So if they find that problem or breach today, you fix it today, you now have a half a year or more before they're going to be able to say that's now your culture. So it's not just enough to find the problems. You have to expect that time to integrate them. It takes 13 weeks to make a habit. You're going to have to show that this is their habits. This is their approach to what they do.
If I can jump in, please. As a culture, you have to make sure that the public statement is, this is important, and you have to live by those values. The greatest example I can show you publicly is JP Morgan Chase. So the year that JP Morgan Chase got breached, they were woefully underspending on cybersecurity. The reason I say that without saying the number is the following year, they went to $250 million for cybersecurity annually. The year after that, they went up to $500 million annually for cybersecurity. Last year, Jamie Dimon publicly said they spent in excess of $600 million annually for cybersecurity. And so that has become a culture there because it directly affects their bottom line. Let's face it, banks are in the business of making money. And when you have a large bank like JP Morgan Chase that's willing to spend in excess of $600 million now annually on their cybersecurity, they have recognized how painful that can be, especially with reputation, and they're taking it seriously now.
Rick, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Who?
I just wanted, you're nodding your head, so I thought maybe you wanted to add something to that.
No, the only thing that brought to mind is that I remember, it's a side thing, but I remember GE bragging one time that they spent $1 million on a department, on their taxation department, so they could figure out how not to pay taxes. Doing that annually. So again, the emphasis on culture. it really starts at the top and what you're going to accept. And if you want it to be successful, it's got to be, again, implemented throughout all the different tiers of anybody who's participating.
And I've always said this, security is an annoyance to everyone. So you get them used to doing it as part of their daily routine, because like on Technology Partners, we use two-factor authentication. So every time I connect in, I have to go and check my phone, which means I have to have my phone with me. But now I just do it. It's not like, oh my gosh, I got to go get my phone to log into my email. I just have my phone to log into my email. But I'll tell you, when it first started, it was the most annoying thing I could do. But it does make a difference. And once you get it into a habit, it stops being an annoyance. But we got to get past that.
So that's debatable. That's half a joke. The reason I say that is on the National Security Council, I worked with a guy from the FBI, and when he would log into certain FBI networks, it was two-factor authentication. Well, we worked in a SCIF, a secret facility where you can't bring a phone into, so you'd have to run outside like really fast, check his phone for the PIN, and then hustle back inside before he timed out so he could log into the FBI network. And it was not uncommon to see him doing this multiple times because he just couldn't do it fast enough. Now, Ken, the one thing I would like to hit that you said about security is security is paramount. Yes, and so the one thing I want people to understand is compliance does not necessarily equal security as well. And the Department of Defense has been great about illuminating the how that is true, because they've been compliant many a time, but they still were not secure because the compliance rules were not written well. Just like how the credit card company association was a PCI. I forget the second part of their title, but they used to always say if your credit card machine got breached, well, you weren't compliant. Well, yeah, they were compliant, but your standards for compliance were so low.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I always tell people is, at some point, even with the best security, somebody can get through. I mean, that's one of the things we had talked about earlier was that conversation about risk. The job of risk is to mitigate it, not remove it. You can, I mean, I had a friend, he exercised every day, he ate right, and he still passed away at 40. You can get breached, even if you do everything right. But the probability of getting breached is much lower. And if you are breached, you can show that you did everything right. And then you can find out why you got breached and take those steps. If you don't have all that structure in place and you get breached, you're flying in the wind. And I think that's a big thing.
So interestingly enough, I got something to dovetail off of that to show how that's how we're trying to shape society now. One of my last projects on the NSC was writing the National Maritime Cybersecurity Plan. And so we involved people in it such as NIST because nobody writes risk standards for operational technology devices and their cybersecurity. It doesn't exist. None of the insurance companies will cover them then. And so when NIST started their work on a framework, we started pulling in insurance companies, legal firms, and stuff like that that specialize in both cybersecurity and OT technologies, so that we had a broader swath. It wasn't regulatory, but we were using soft power at that point because the insurance companies have now something to say, yeah, we'll cover you, but this is what your premium is going to be because we have a gold standard, this NIST standard. And when you get breached, we have lawyers saying, yes, you were or were not diligent in your actions because there's this NIST standard. And that way we get away from the compulsory requirements because this is a global effort here at this particular point. And it's kind of analogous to some of our manufacturing efforts. If we have a global effort here and we can standardize some of this stuff and bring the soft power to play, such as were you diligent or not, and do you have legal ramifications, then we can put this across the board. And it won't just be the Department of Defense doing some of this stuff and using contracts as the weapon to enforce it.
Drew, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I mean, I think the key here is to develop a plan based on the type of business that you're in, right? And then engage the right resources, whether it's going to a team NEO or another nonprofit, or back to your own school that you went to, where you know, or someone on your team has some sort of certification, and figuring out what is the best course of action, right? Because the course of action for each manufacturer is going to be different depending on whether you are a software developer, or you are a, you know, data repository company, or you are a manufacturer of widgets or nuts or bolts or airplane parts, right? I've done work for Boeing and GSK and Northrop Grumman and you know, companies like that, where, you know, they have rooms inside of their manufacturing facility that you can't go into unless you have clearance, right? I mean, it's really about figuring out what type of business that you want, what type of business that you have, and figuring out where the best resources are for you to get the knowledge, and then port that knowledge over to your company and get the right people on it and make it scalable for your business so that you can actually comply.
Yeah, let me say a little bit about that then too. One of the other things, especially as a manufacturer in this region, and then again, Ken can help me out here though. One of my suggestions is you may want to contact your PTAC. In fact, we have a very good PTAC in Cleveland. And that is, frankly, her name is Karen. That is her job, is to help the defense-oriented manufacturers get the help they need. And she can also set you up with really quick information webinars that you can sign up for that are all primers. So at least you'll get some background first as to what you're generally looking for. The other thing is, then she also has a list of, again, the RPOs at this point, or any of the organizations looking for RPOs, and or at least going after the RPO. So in other words, she can give you a list of organizations that are close by that can help you, in fact, start the whole process up and be informed in every one of your your efforts as you go forward. So don't try to do it alone. And there again, you can go to, for example, PTAC or TME or any one of those other organizations like this that deal with manufacturers, and you'll be able to get contacts as you need to go start your, I guess, your journey.
Well, we are at 1 o'clock on the dot. I do want to just thank all of our attendees for coming today, and we will have this recording available. We're going to have to do some editing. We should have this recording available sometime early next weekend, right? Not over promising there. And it will be available. You'll be able to find it on our On Technology Partners Facebook, and then also our YouTube channel. There will be a survey that will be emailed to all the attendees today. And that survey is just how well did we do? And then some event topics that you'd be interested in our next webinar that we will be hosting that you'd like us to cover. And it can be anything manufacturing or CMMC compliance related.
Anybody want to say anything as we wrap up here?
Only thing I would like to say is thank you for the opportunity to participate today. I greatly enjoyed it. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thanks a lot. We're glad to have you, and your information and experience have been absolutely phenomenal.
I echo Dr. Mike's sentiments, and I thank Rick and Casey and Ken and Dr. Mike and all those who participated. Excellent discussion. Thank you.
Yes, and I want to say we use Drew ourselves. If you are looking at contracts with primes and you're a sub, you want to have a lawyer like Drew. He's going to make sure that it makes sense. I know this is a direct plug, but I guess that's what this is all about anyways. But no, he's been a good friend of mine personally, and he's done a phenomenal job with us in getting through different compliances. We've worked with HIPAA, we've worked with lots of different compliance conversations, and having that lawyer to make sure you're doing the right things, because we talked at the beginning, after you're sued, it's too late to have those conversations. You want to make sure that those contracts are good. We have read terrible contracts where it basically says we have to pay for everything if something goes wrong. You want to make sure you don't sign it just because it's a great idea. And lawyers will help you do it. Good lawyers will help you do that right. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to make sure he was on the panel as well. And then of course,
Thank you.
Forever too.
I just wanted to say I'm humbled to be included on such a panel of expertise, and I enjoyed the enjoyed the interaction. Thanks for putting it all together, Ken. Do a great job.
Oh, no, and Team Neo
And Mark.
has been phenomenal. I mean, what you're doing for the region, and it's important because I think one of the problems that is important out there is manufacturers don't know where to go sometimes, especially when you're talking about these new compliance roles. And knowing there are these nonprofits to start your journey is very important because we're going to make money. We're going to charge for our time. Knowing that you can talk to somebody that may not charge as the entry point can be very helpful because you only have so much money to spend. And those nonprofits in the region, and there's lots of regions that have them. Ours is the best, of course, but that's a good place to start when you're looking.